So I think number one is that CMMI has delivered on their promise of coming up with another model to back up OCM, right? And they did say that it was going to be a two-sided risk model, so they stayed true to that. I think there's a lot that still needs to be discussed and worked out. We've only had it for a week, so today is November 8th. This was released on Friday of last week. So just preliminary looking at it and reading through it and listening to different perspectives at the feedback session, I think there are components of it that are very similar to OCM, and they did listen to a couple of different things. I think the biggest buckets that are different is, number one, the MPP prospective payment versus the MEOS payment. And one of the questions we have is, how is that going to be calculated? Because practices are going to have to rely on that in lieu of fee-for-service payment and a MEOS payment on top of that to make sure all of their costs are covered, not only for their actual day-to-day care of the patient, but also for any sort of resources they have to invest in to actually meet the parameters of the model. So that's probably one of the biggest question marks in people's mind, is how is that payment going to be actually adjudicated and what is the number, right? I think there's still some very complicated formulas involved in the pricing methodology, and I think the word transparency comes to mind. Of it can be more transparent, and we hope that they would be a lot more transparent with how the pricing methodology is determined. That could still be yet to come. And I think interestingly enough, the two tracks for risk, I like that idea, because there are practices that may have a higher risk tolerance and are able and willing to take that on and are predicted to have more success in that. But for those practices that don't fit that high risk model, there is another track you can take. I think that there needs to be some consideration for practices that have dropped out of the model and forcing them into a two-sided model when they've dropped from the model because for whatever reason, they just, two-sided risk wasn't the right way to go. They didn't have the resources to invest in the model. I don't think it's fair for them to jump into a two-sided risk model. So I think there needs to be some consideration given to that as well. But overall, I think it's a step in the right direction. I think there are still some things that need to be looked at. I for one, feel that the way that they have structured it and similar to OCM, I think is a good thing, because you're not reinventing the wheel. You're just sort of hopefully improving on it. And I'm hoping and I'm hopeful that, and I know that the intent of CMMI is to ensure that this model is better than the first iteration of OCM, and that more practices are willing to take on that two-sided risk and making it more attractive for those practices. So that's the end result. We'll see what happens. It's very, very early. So once the commenting is done and the actual proposed rule becomes final, I'll have a lot more insight into whether or not this will be successful for practices.